Welcome, everyone, to the very first episode of the Libertarian Lens podcast, one where we intend to invite people who have expressed interesting ideas and where we would like to conduct, interesting conversation and exchange of ideas. And I'm very happy to introduce shortly our very first guest, Clayton Reeder. Clayton and I were speakers at a conference in Calgary last May called Capitalism and Morality. And I must say Clayton's speech was very, very impressive. Clearly he's very bright, very well read, and it was an impressive piece of work. And I thought we should have him on to discuss some of his ideas. His speech was the anatomy of the modern leftism, and I'm looking forward to discussing this. Clayton, welcome to the podcast, and maybe you could briefly introduce yourself to our viewers.
Thank you, Jacques. It's very nice to be here, and thank you for your kind words. It was very nice meeting you in Calgary a few months ago, and I enjoyed your speech very much as well. For me, I've been in what you might call the libertarian world for a few decades now. My normal life is in corporate finance, but other than that, I like philosophy and political things, and I've run the Calgary Libertarian Meetup, which is sort of a social group that gets together for lectures or just hanging out and complaining about the government. We do that once or twice a month, and it's been going on forever. It's become a real Calgary institution that's been a lot of fun. We've met a lot of cool people, a lot of weird people, and we all have a good time. And then otherwise, I would certainly call myself a libertarian, particularly in more the Rothbardian tradition specifically. But I like to draw upon any intellectual tradition that is helpful to that kind of foundation. So I'll explore anything and everything that can be just help the philosophy and help kind of motivate people and kind of understand where we are in this crazy world.
Would you say that you came to libertarianism at a sort of quasi-fixed point in your life, or would you say, "Oh, I've always been a libertarian"?
I guess there's kind of it's like that beard fallacy. Have you ever heard that, where it's like, at what point you're growing hair on your face, but at what point does it actually become a beard as opposed to just some longer whiskers? So there's kind of an ambiguous transition point, I suppose, but I think it goes way back to high school. And I think I had a bit of an instinct or an intuition that some things we were hearing in our education just didn't quite jive. And this was late 90s, so internet wasn't quite as robust in terms of material, but there was the Mises Institute, which was very helpful. They had a lot of good free resources, and I discovered Mises through that, mainly motivated to kind of, I guess, being contrarian by nature, as many libertarians tend to be. I was interested in challenging some of the ideas of a social studies teacher we had, and I had a good relationship with him. Wasn't bitter. We had some fun arguments and discussions, but I was looking for resources to help, and stumbled across Ayn Rand, stumbled across the Mises Institute, stumbled across different kinds of free market economic analysis, and it just worked with me. It kind of fit with my intuitions, but intuition's not enough. So it became a case of, how do I defend these intuitions? How do I build up a coherent philosophy around it to really be confident in these kinds of ideas? Really motivated around a sense of free markets being better, and justice requiring something along the lines, at least, of a libertarian ethical view.
Okay, so you had 25-year head start on me. If you were a libertarian in high school, because I came to be one probably in my mid-40s. Although it's interesting that Mises.org played a crucial role in that. Okay, so as I stated, your presentation was called "The Anatomy of the Modern Leftism." It's very comprehensive, but I was wondering if you could give us an overview of what you said in there, and then there's a few points that I would like to address and probably ask you to expand.
So I was joking with the founder of the event, because he was trying to guess how many words the speech was, and it was long. I had to cram quite a bit of content into my hour or 50-minute slot. So yeah, it did cover a lot of ground, and to give an overview now, I mean, there's kind of a few chunks, I guess you could say, but the first part I really wanted to emphasize for the audience was how we do have this sense that there's kind of a problem with modern leftism. Like, it's become very hostile to liberty, and I know there's some debate about where left and right fits into the libertarian world, but one way or another, I think a lot of people do agree that modern leftism's kind of gone a little crazy. How you want to diagnose that, there's going to be different opinions, but one thing I wanted to do was distinguish this new leftism from sort of classical Marxism, because especially on the right, and libertarians do this too, we throw around the Marxist label all the time, somewhat capriciously, and it becomes kind of the all-encompassing label for anything sort of that smacks of leftism that we don't like. But classical Marxism is very, very different, in my opinion, from what this new, more, I guess, sophisticated kind of leftism has become. So with classical Marxism, we really have a theory of exploitation and an economic theory and a theory of historical development. But Marx's idea that basically the economic forces or the material productive forces are what determine the culture and determine the other aspects of society, he kind of got that backwards. And I referred to another communist who was sort of an anti-Marxian communist, because he basically went against Marx's core metaphysical theory about, the historical dialectic and how the economic productive factors determine the social relations. It's Antonio Gramsci, and he was locked up in Italy in the 1920s. Jail, maybe that's a good place for communism, but what he did is tried to work out some of the contradictions that he was seeing in the Marxist theory and how it was playing out in real life. I won't elaborate on his observations that prompted that too much for now, but he basically said Marx had it totally upside down. It's not the material productive forces that determine the rest of society. It's really the culture that determines kind of the power relations, instead of the other way around. So if you remember maybe your old social studies textbooks about Marxism, and you've got the base and then the superstructure on top of it, there's the economic stuff at the bottom, and then there's all the other stuff like culture and religion and all these other things on top. Gramsci points out that culture and kind of the subjective or the ethical aspect is what drives forces, and his idea was basically to turn leftism into the new religion that would replace kind of the religious paradigm of the West, so that communism or the socialist vision could really take over, because they were encountering all these, they weren't getting the proletariat revolution that they'd anticipated in the capitalist countries. All they really had was a violent revolution in Russia. and they didn't even have a capitalist phase in history. So Gramsci's trying to work all this out, and so he comes to basically this anti-Marxian position where it's all about changing the culture. Obviously, the whole culture war thing and cultural issues have become a lot more prominent, especially in libertarian discussions to some degree too. Like I remember 10 years ago, economics was the big thing, and Ron Paul was very influential. People were talking about central banks and taxes and deficits, and those were the big things. Now, of course, a lot of the issues revolve around cultural factors, and I think a lot of that is sort of in response to the way the left has kind of put, or the modern left has put its tentacles into things. And it's a very different kind of thing because what we think of is, I mean, I hate the term, but it's like the woke left or this post-Marxist left has a very different character where it's not really emphasized on economics. It actually kind of recruits to some degrees the commanding heights of the capitalist system or the crony capitalist system, or, you know, big business is really involved in kind of pushing some of these cultural ideas in some respects. And, you know, it's interesting because not only has the emphasis changed, but kind of the bad guys have changed too. It's not like the evil bourgeoisie who's crushing everyone. It's the I don't know, it's the Christian man, it's the heterosexual white man, or whatever. They've created kind of new boogeymen. And some of the, I mean, Marx didn't really care about the cultural issues so much. Those were more incidental questions for him. But the modern left is all about culture. And in terms of their ability to influence institutions and shape the culture, which is something I discuss later in the speech, they're far more sophisticated than rather kind of the crude and brutish kind of communism that we saw in the 20th century. This is digging way more deeper, almost into the DNA of the societies, and, you know, reprogramming people, if you want to use a term like that. And so it's become very, very sophisticated. That was kind of the first aspect of what I talked about that day, because I wanted to distinguish it from this kind of catch-all Marxist idea. Sometimes we throw around the term cultural Marxism, and I think that's kind of a misnomer, because cultural Marxism, again, it goes against kind of that economic base of the theory for Marxism. The new left is kind of anti-Marxist in a way, or it's post-Marxist is a better way to understand it. Classical Marxism doesn't really have a lot of real defenders, but this new leftism, however you want to characterize it, again, I really don't like the term woke left. I understand that it's useful and people do kind of have a sense of what it's referring to. I just don't really like the terminology. I find it kind of annoying, but that's just my personal preference. But whatever this post-Marxist leftism is, I worry that it's a lot more sophisticated. It's digging way deeper into how it wishes to reform society. And because the left tends towards revolution, I think ultimately it's very dangerous, the path this goes down. I don't know how it plays out exactly, but I think ultimately there's kind of a crisis point that this would have to reach. And unfortunately, a lot of those things end in blood and guts and violence, and I would prefer not to see things like that. But I don't know, the march of the modern leftist movement is kind of scary in some ways.
How about we, I said I was going to wait until you had covered all and then go back to some of my question, but it might be better actually if we address, I had highlighted, you said, for one thing, modern leftism is totally divorced from the materialist foundation of Marxist historical theory, and Marx was not in the least concerned with gender expression, alternative sexual lifestyle, or the idea of the white man being some supreme oppressor. What, I mean, this is purely speculative, but what do you think his reaction would be to see what is going on? Like, my sense is that there's tend to be an awful lot of inner, well, more than struggle. I think that the left tends to eats itself, because they hold to these truths, and anyone who varies ever so slightly from any of them will tend to be ostracized or canceled. Would he be a pariah today?
That's a very interesting question, and it's interesting to think about what the answer might be. Like, if you could go back in a time machine, grab Marx and bring him and say, hey, what do you think of these leftists in 2024? I think he'd be a little confused by the whole thing, because for Marx, it was all about bourgeoisie versus proletariat, and the way they've structured oppressed and oppressor in more the modern left is very divorced from how Marx saw it. I don't think the modern left cares much about the proletariat as the working class, despite some of the lingo sometimes they'll throw around. I think they've created a different kind of different oppressed groups, which may or may not be associated with the working class in any meaningful way. So I think that would have confused Marx, and all the emphasis on racial and sexual kind of grievance politics, I think he would also be rather confused by, because he would say all these things are kind of derivative of the main problem, whereas the modern left has elevated those to the real source of all the issues and the source of the conflict. So that's, I think his reaction would mainly be confusion, maybe disappointment, because they've deviated so far from the Marxist orthodoxy.
Okay. I have you mentioned before how there's an awful lot of buy-in, or at least on the surface of corporate capitalists. You say here a lot of them are key allies to the new left. Normally, capitalists are under major threats of Marx's communist revolution. The new capitalist is intimately connected with the new power structure through frameworks like ESG, DEI, or Green New Deal. They aren't putting up a fight, they're helping to push these things. Now, I have pondered this. So first of all, I agree, but I have pondered for a long time why that is. And one of my theories, and I think there are probably many explanations. I think in some cases, you got people leading these companies who are simply using their corporate power to advance something that they, as individuals, believe in. But I've often wondered how many of these companies are using it more as a marketing element, or at least an anti-cancel element, where, yeah, well, we're going to put up a rainbow flag every June. We're going to appear to go along. We don't necessarily believe it, but it's better than being canceled. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I've wondered about that a lot myself. I mean, I think there's elements of the true believer, which ties in with some of the religious overtones that I paint the modern left with later in this in the talk. But you've got the true believers, and they are aspects within these corporations that are able to some degree push the things they'd like to see. Obviously, I think as well, there is a marketing aspect to it. It's kind of like letting people know what team you're on, because they think there's some advantage there. But, well, you've probably heard kind of the cliche that some people throw around, like, get woke, go broke. I think in reality, it often works the opposite direction. Like, if your company's kind of stagnating or failing a bit, it might be this last ditch effort to try and gain some relevance, gain some purchase in people's minds, and get your products maybe on the shopping cart on Amazon or what have you. And so I think there's a bit of a mystery. Like, again, there's a mix of the true believer and sort of people going along, or maybe just the more cynical type that, hey, maybe we can use this to increase some sales. I don't know if there is a clear answer that covers the whole situation, but I think, and I don't know if I'm right about this entirely, but I think there's a really big aspect in terms of just how much political loot is up for grabs, and how cronyism has become so significant as a source of wealth for really, really big, the strongest, most politically connected corporations, that if they basically align themselves ideologically with people who are dishing out the money, I think it can be economically lucrative for them. I don't think that would explain all of these cases we see, but I think there's certainly an aspect of that. It's like, I'm on their team, I'm not on the other team. Therefore, maybe I can get a big subsidy for my, I don't know, whatever, my solar panel business, or even, my bread making business. Sometimes you never really know why these subsidies are dished out the way they are. But there is a lot of money. And of course, if you're one of the bad guys, you're probably not going to get the subsidy. If you're one of the good guys, you're much more likely to get it. So I think it's kind of like drawing lines in the sand. We're over here, not with the bad guys. So please give us money. We want to be on the list as a potential recipient.
Okay, and I think I had okay. Well, two things before I let you continue. There is, I don't know if you ever saw it, there is an article that was actually called "First You Go Woke and Then You Go Broke," which was an analysis of four, I believe, U.S. companies that started out with very good business models. They were successful, and as the article points out, they stopped looking at what was important and started to get involved in all kinds of woke things, and eventually did go broke because they weren't, well, they abandoned their business model. So I get your point, and I totally agree. There's a lot of money, and a lot of money is being channeled towards people that you like, at the government level. But now you also have a line in here about that. It's very hard to defeat reality. Reality always punches back. And again, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that some of these wins, if you want to call them that, on the part of these companies or other people, are temporary in nature. But temporary can be a long time too.
Yeah, there's like socialism, it seems like it's working and it's a huge success at first, and then reality, the walls start to close in. And that's one of the crazy things about the modern left. Like the point, I think that's paraphrased from somewhere else where I saw it, so I can't claim that idea is original or anything, but the idea is the left seems to be escalating in its craziness in some ways, like impossible goals like total equality, or you can totally change who you are, or just these, or you can control the weather, or you can eliminate sickness, you can make sure everyone never gets the flu again. All these kind of really, really utopian or grand schemes that find their home in the modern left. They all conflict with kind of basic reality, like, no, you will get sick. No, you cannot control the weather. No, you cannot make all people equal just based on how humanity is. There's always going to be differences among everyone. But when you've made those kinds of things your goal, and you're opposed to reality, it becomes this kind of claim on limitless resources, because you'll never defeat the real world, so to speak. You can try to reform it or reconfigure it or wield so much power that things change the way you want, but eventually kind of the natural order of things has to reassert itself. So you've got this never-ending battle that motivates the left to achieve or try and achieve things that are essentially impossible by nature. And because you can never truly defeat it, you will always need more resources. You'll always need more power. It's like the war on terrorism. You're never going to make the terrorists disappear completely, but you can keep getting more weapons and more power and more spying or surveillance capability or what have you, all based on the promise that, yes, we will defeat this eternal enemy someday. Just submit and go along with it and open up your wallet. We'll make it happen. It's
Well,
also one of the dangerous characteristics of how the left has gone these days.
I would also add that it's almost like a grievance factory, because when they do achieve what, to my mind, were sensible goals, such as trying to make sure that everyone had access, or equal opportunity, I think is the term that is used. And I'd say for the most part, we've achieved that. But as soon as we did, they moved the goalpost, right? Because now it was like, oh, well, we've done that, but now we realize that with equal opportunity, my goodness, the outcomes are not equal. So now we have to work on equal outcome. And I see this in other, like another one would be, the treatment of gays, where, once upon a time, a dreadful time, where there were actually people going out and, gay bashing was acceptable, right? And we've won that victory. But then, again, having won that, they have to move the goalposts, because now you have to affirm people. Right now, there's there's a whole industry about affirming people, when in fact, at least from the negative rights point of view, the only thing that is demanded of you is not to go out and beat them up, or or abuse them or whatever. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever to me that you now have to abide by affirming all kinds of people. But that's what I mean by grievance factories, that they have a win, and then, well, that's not good enough, and you have to move on to something else.
Yeah, the ultimate victory is kind of by design very hard to achieve, and you always have to keep moving the goalpost, because if you go back to the war on terrorism kind of idea, if you kill all the terrorists, well, then all the justification for the resources you need and the power you need to fight the bad guys, all of a sudden it's all gone. Like, hey, we achieved it. So in a way, you don't really want to solve the problem, or if you do or become close to solving the problem, you kind of have to add more to it. It's kind of like some people talk about, like, for example, the safe supply industry, which I think is kind of controversial, and obviously there's different opinions about it. But if you kind of think about some of the incentives, like there's obviously strong incentives within that sector to not solve the problem, or if it's just like, well, let's not, torment people with drug abuse problems. But then it becomes, well, no, that's not enough. We have to provide the drugs now, or now we have to continually extend the lengths to which we'll go to address a problem. When I mean, I know what you mean. There's it's a goalpost shifting thing, and part of it is just kind of the nature of how I think the left has to operate, where it has to tend towards this total flattening and this removal of all difference. And so if there's something marginalized, or there's something that doesn't seem right in the leftist mentality, they have to bring it. It has to be fixed. Like, just the fact that there's difference, that must be something wrong, or the fact that something's not perfect, that means we have to use more power.
Well said. If we haven't lost a thread, do you want to continue on your summary of your speech?
Well, where maybe it gets kind of a little more into, because I talked about how Gramsci said He wanted basically socialism to become the new religion of the West, because otherwise there'd be this resistance to the goals of the socialists. So it had to really kind of infiltrate into the culture, like really get into people's hearts and minds. And one of the big things I wanted to emphasize is just sort of this messianic aspect to the leftist promise, which is, I characterize it as like almost going back to the Garden of Eden, like fixing the fallen state of man and redeeming him, and basically taking on kind of that Messiah role to in the form of its political programs, to create kind of that universal collectivist utopia where all the differences have been wiped out, all the obviously, to paint it in a good way, you'd think of it like, well, we've eliminated all oppressor and oppressed relationships, and now it's just everyone is equal and everyone gets along, kumbaya and such. But we'd probably agree that the effort to totally flatten and equalize and make everything the same itself tends towards kind of perversity and violence and a lot of danger. But a big thing is just this this religious aspect to it all. And some people say, you know, politics is just a way of working out a kind of theology, and maybe there's some truth to that. But we've seen this kind of weird pattern come out of the modern left, and maybe the easiest way to see it is the whole virus panic thing from a few years ago, because for whatever reason, and I wouldn't have expected this going into the virus panic, but the right tended to be more resistant to some of the draconian lockdown controls, and like the medical passport stuff and all that. And the left really kind of grabbed onto that. And that was a real puzzle for me. Like, what's going on here? Why did it turn out that way? Because you think of like on kind of a moral paradigm of, let's say, cleanliness versus uncleanliness, or purity versus impurity, and how that kind of maps onto social pathogens or disease and stuff. It's just something you tend to think the right would be a lot more aggressive on, but it was the left that really grabbed onto it. And I don't know, maybe it's because it was a way for them to go after Trump and they don't like Trump, or, I mean, I don't know. There's aspects to it, but think of some of the religious kind of characteristics that went along with the whole virus mentality. So you had priests, which were the doctors or the experts, the public health officials. A lot of them aren't even really doctors in the conventional sense, but they might have a PhD in public health or something, or but you get a whole batch of heresies. You get the heretics. Pardon me.
Yeah. I said blasphemers.
Heretics, and then specifically there you get like baptisms and anointings, and with the medicine or the approved medicine that lets you be part of this new holy community and such. But it's not just the virus panic. Like, you see it in all kinds of things. Like in 2020 when they had like the George Floyd riots and that whole upsurge of the social justice issue around race and things, summer 2020, very similar kind of stuff. Like there was again confessing your sins. There was, what were some of the other examples? Original sin, right? You might have privilege, or you might be programmed with implicit bias, and you've got your witch hunts, and you've got martyrs and saints and doomsday predictions that we're all going to die. And then of course a promised day of judgment where we're all kind of reconciled and hopefully go into the new creation and all the bad stuff is left behind. But it's, the modern left is really taken on kind of this weird religious flavor that creeps me out in a lot of ways. because that's where you get like the true believer. And this ties into kind of maybe a broader point from that section of the speech, which is that we, especially as libertarians, and I take this very seriously, we want to push our ideas, and we believe that our ideas are good, our philosophy is good, and people just need to kind of hear about it and get the case pitched to them, and maybe they'll come on board. But in the marketplace of ideas, the whole system's kind of rigged. And this goes to the idea that comes from some of the neo-reaction or NRX kind of stuff, Curtis Yarvin's the best known, but the whole idea of the cathedral, which is that a lot of what we think of as power isn't necessarily in the political system, but it's who forms the paradigm in which we talk and argue about things. And that idea of the cathedral, which is, the academy or the universities and the media, like these aren't government institutions in the same way like the Department of Defense is or something. But nonetheless, these are shaping the way we think, and they're shaping the way we operate in the world. And the example I use is the Catholic Church is kind of the classic medieval version of this, but now instead of the Catholic Church forming kind of like the paradigm through which people think, now it's this new leftist religion. And they've got the universities, which are basically like the left-wing seminaries where the new religious class is taught, or the ruling class is taught. A lot of, in of course, elite universities, that's sort of a fast track to the ruling class in a lot of ways. But this whole system, kind of sticking with the religious metaphor, it really is like what we think of as the old medieval Catholic Church, where you might be a British guy, you might be a French guy, you might be a Polish guy, a Hungarian guy, and you've got your different loyalties, but your paradigm that has structured your thought is very much influenced by that quote unquote cathedral, that system that basically forms the societal consensus. So even in us as dissidents, like we have a lot of questions about the modern paradigm, but we're still very influenced, and our thinking patterns are very much constructed by that whole system that's built up around us. So the game is kind of rigged against us in a lot of ways. Even if our ideas are perfect, it's not necessarily enough just to have the right ideas, because for various reasons, the wrong ideas can be stronger in a lot of ways. Maybe not forever, but on the near to medium term, sometimes they do have the edge because they've kind of rigged the arena in which the marketplace of ideas should naturally be able to work its own thing out.
Now, I think at one point, you correctly identified the taking over of certain institutions, universities. We've already talked about some of the corporate world, schools, and there again, I have wondered, like if I speak, as the leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada, and people had warned me when I was elected that dealing with libertarians is like herding cats. And
True.
Yeah, and what I have found, of course, is I think the number one desire of most libertarians is to be left alone. Most libertarians that I know, in fact, every libertarian that I know, has zero interest in controlling other people's lives. So they don't get drawn to institutions that would give them the power to start bossing people around.
Yeah.
So in many ways, I think what has happened, and I am not a small c conservative, but I think conservative people in general terms would be closer to sort of a libertarian mindset that way, which kind of creates a vacuum in all of these institutions where now you have the people who, get their jollies by bossing people around, by they have this zeal because they've anointed themselves as the holders of the truth, and the rest of us have to be instructed or ordered, even better, if we deviate from what they perceive to be the truth. And in many ways, it becomes self-fulfilling because now they have the power I mean, your observation is bang on. I'm simply providing what I think is a contributing factor.
No, that's a huge point, and that's something, especially coming out of the virus panic, where I think the whole world went basically crazy. And I'm like, how do we deal with this kind of thing, like these kinds of people? Because obviously you've got the group, and in certain contexts it'll be more on the right or more on the left, but there's always going to be a group that's like, just leave me alone, I don't want to mess with you, just don't mess with me. And a lot of people are fine that way. The problem is, and this is really the deep challenge for libertarians in the modern age, and this is an idea that bounces around out there, and it's basically that the people who want to be left alone are always going to lose to the people who don't want to leave you alone. So you can't just be left alone and then have the other group that won't leave you alone, because they're basically incompatible. The nature or the pathology of the other group is that they will not leave you alone. So you can't necessarily sell them on the idea that, hey, just live and let live, because that goes against their whole, I wouldn't call it a philosophy, but just their orientation in the world. So whether you're a hardcore libertarian guy, or maybe a conservative guy, or maybe like a left-wing hippie kind of guy, a lot of people do want to be left alone. But the people who don't want to leave you alone, that's not good enough for them. They specifically do not want to leave you alone, because again, if you think of it in terms of the leftist mentality, kind of this pathological leftist mentality, they have to change you. They have to control you. They have to change you. You cannot be left alone, because you being left alone is the problem. And whether it's because, well, if we leave you alone, you might be racist, or if we leave you alone, then you might oppress marginalized people. And so this is a real tension, and I think people are still trying to figure out how to basically deal with this problem of modern society. Because if everyone wanted to be left alone and just, cooperate, get along with whoever wants to work with you, that would be good. That's basically the ultimate goal for the libertarian. How do we defend ourselves, or how do we work to protect ourselves against people who fundamentally just are not going to be on board with the whole idea?
Yeah, but just to push a little, well, not a counter push, but don't you think it's actually weird what has happened to the left? I mean, once upon a time, they would have been the one arguing for freedom and to be left alone to act in the way that they, like whether it was to smoke marijuana or to have sex with someone of the same sex. Right? Like their idea was, look, I'm not doing any harm, leave me alone. And there were people on the other side saying, no, we're going to tell you what to do. And now it's almost like a role reversal, because, we have gained these freedom, but your own freedom, we I don't know, we disagree with them, or we want to control things. Like every time we disagree with you, we need to control it.
Yeah, and that's a thing too. I mean, people have a tendency, and we all have to watch, even if we consider ourselves hardcore libertarians, we have to watch the natural tendency in people. Like, we want freedom for something we care about, but we can't allow it in something else where it's going to be a problem if people can make their own choices. And you get a lot of this actually in some of the modern, or what I would call maybe left liberal types who, you'd put them on the left because they just by process of elimination, they wouldn't be what we might call right-wing types. But the thing is, they thought, well, we've gone far enough. Like, say we basically did what we needed to do about the 90s, and the left, I didn't leave the left left me. You might have heard that before. Like, the left just went too far. I was on board with it up till this point, but once it started going into crazy town, I wasn't on board with it anymore. And maybe that raises the issue of sort of this internal logic to leftism where it just can't stop. Like, if you think of progressivism, sorry, let me back up. If you think of libertarianism, we have strict limits to things. Like, we know the line where we've crossed it. And if you really want to simplify it, it's the aggressive violence issue, or, certain roles for government that it shouldn't have. We know where the line is crossed. For the progressive leftist who just seems to have no limit, they don't have that line. Like, it's like the goalpost shifting thing. The goal always becomes bigger and grander. And so you might get off the leftist train, say in the 90s or something, once we've achieved, like, I don't know, what's your example? Say we've got, I'm blanking out. I don't know, something that a lot of libertarians fought for, which is like the whole marijuana thing. So a lot of people would be like, okay, let's stop there. We've achieved that goal. But in the progressive mentality, you can't stop at any given point. Like, there's no limit. There's no point at which you've gone too far. You can always make things more equal. You can always try to reconstruct reality towards, again, that logical endpoint, which is like the perfect communist utopia. So I think that's one of the problems. Like, you can win some victories on the road of the left-wing path, and then you can get off the road. But leftism itself doesn't stop where you get off the road. Its logic will just carry it on and on and on, which, you go from legalizing marijuana to the government is now the drug dealer, and they will give you free heroin to go inject in yourself down at the C train station or something. And once that's become the point, some people think, well, that's gone far enough, but there will always be another scheme that can take it another step further.
Again, well said. I am aware of the time here, so I'm wondering if we might just move to your conclusion, because I'd like to keep this to about an hour. I don't know, maybe we're doing your speech a disfavor by moving to that, but I think we've covered a lot of good ground already.
Well, the end of the speech is where things get maybe a little. This is where I was afraid I was going to lose people, and I, with my co-organizer for the event, I was making a lot of jokes about maybe this is just a little too, maybe this is a little too much for this type of presentation, but this is where you kind of get into, I guess, the cosmic symbolism of left versus right, and order and chaos. And I want to be clear, even though I would consider myself a right-wing person, the right can go into the dark side just as the left can. Like, there's pathological evil versions of both, and then there's properly ordered versions of both, which I think like the proper structuring, of course, would lean more right, but you need like a little bit of the leftist element as kind of a check on it, or I don't know if that makes sense. But I think the main thing, again, it's kind of circling back to this idea of what is the ultimate goal of leftism. And it's like redeeming the fallen man. Like, man redeems man with power and recreating the fallen order, the return to the Garden of Eden, so to speak, or however you want to characterize it, Shangri-La or the Land of Plenty, or Charles Fourier's Oceans of Lemonade. But the reason it's like, I kind of associate leftism with chaos, which is not my idea or anything. It's sort of a general symbolic connection. But the sort of this leftist theology, or this religious aspect to the left, it's like it boils down to kind of what the ultimate goal is. Like if you achieved the perfect leftist vision, what would it be? And it's egalitarianism. It's like all men are equal, versus the right, where it's more of a structured hierarchy, and such, where you have difference, but it's ordered properly so that everything works correctly. So the idea of leftist chaos, like, and this is one of the reasons why I think the way the left has become so crazy and gone off the rails, its logical endpoint is basically this chaos where all difference is gone, all like there's just basically one identity. It's uniformity. The leftist utopia is all about people being the same. There's no envy. No one is better or worse than anyone else. No one has more or less than anyone else. All one language, all one kind of culture that's comes out of the blender from everything going into it to kind of take on this leftist paradigm for itself. There's a quote I really like, which is hierarchies are celestial and in hell all are equal. And might be a biased way to frame it, but I think libertarianism and free markets, they imply order and difference. Like there's the division of labor. There's people who will serve some better than others. They will earn more. They will be rewarded more. And that doesn't mean it's not their role in some way to help those at the margin or help those at the bottom of the hierarchy. But for the left, it's trying to get away from that kind of structure into just chaos, like abolish the individual. It's all the collective mass. It's kind of hard to talk about now, a little bit off the top of my head, because again, it is sort of cosmic in its orientation, kind of more theological or religious symbolism involved. Maybe you can jump in with a specific question or something, but I'm just very troubled by the left's orientation towards chaos, because chaos is bad. That's where the monsters come out, so to speak.
Well, why don't we, spend the last 10 minutes or so about how we combat this movement. You've painted a picture that is somewhat bleak in terms of, they have the institution, they control an awful lot. I mean, they're in government. I used to tell people, maybe back in 2015, that I thought there was a race going on between we libertarians being able to convince a majority of people that libertarianism was the way to go, and a very significant breakdown economically. And I no longer believe that there's a race, because the economic breakdown is going to happen first. I mean, the debt level, the fiat currencies swirling down the toilet bowl, the demographic challenges. I mean, the whole thing is a mess, and we're going to a very, very bad place. And I was kind of hoping that this breakdown would compel people to look for better alternative. But taking a page out of what happened during the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, I mean, you probably know that crisis was predicted to a T by a number of Austrian economists in the US, because they knew what was going on. Now, the congressmen in the US, when it happened, like they have these I forget what they call them. They basically invited people in, right, to try to explain, so that we have to make sure it doesn't happen again. But who did they reach out to? Did they reach out to the people who actually predicted it, or did they reach out to the people who got caught with their pants down? Well, they went to the latter, right? So now I'm thinking, like similarly in this country right now, by pretty much any economic metric, even in terms of and social metric that you can think of, we are far, far worse off after 9 years of Trudeau government. Now, from my perspective, this was entirely predictable, and I predicted it because the question you have to ask is, what are the principles governing the decision-making process? So if you consider Trudeau and his gang, this is people who have learned absolutely nothing from history and firmly believe that central planning works. Well, central planning has an abysmal track record. And more importantly, people who know about Mises and Hayek understand that they cannot work. So if you engage in massive central planning, you are bound for failure. Getting involved in people's lives in massive ways. I mean, are there any aspect of the lives of Canadians where the federal government doesn't feel entitled to somehow get involved? But things are really, really bad. They're going to get worse until it gets kicked out. But my question is that going to wake people up? And I'm not convinced of that. Again, so to summarize what I said, is I was hoping that a catastrophe of the making of people on the left would compel people to look elsewhere. And again, based on the American experience of 2007, 2008, because they're repeating the same mistakes, right? They've learned absolutely nothing. I'm thinking, would a crisis even solve the problem?
Wow. Well, I remember at your speech at the event, you painted a pretty grim picture in terms of the numbers involved. And yeah, we're on kind of the road to ruin. That seems indisputable. But what you said, I think, is really, really interesting and important. And it's interesting to explore that a bit. It's like, because you get these accelerationists, right? People like, just the system needs to die as soon as possible. And then, my vision will rise up from the ashes. But I don't think it's quite that simple, because you think, like, when all the social institutions and the things we rely on break down, then maybe something more libertarianism by necessity has to rise out of that. But it still depends on what people's ideas are, and it's very possible, of course, when we get the disaster, we don't just get some organic upsurge in libertarian social order. It's very likely that if the wrong ideas are too deeply entrenched, that we get something much worse in response to a crisis. And that's, I think, the real concern I have for the direction we're going. I mean, you think, like, I argue about this with some of my friends who I think, like, the slower the collapse happens, the better, because that gives us more time to kind of build our alternative institutions and prepare ourselves economically and morally for that change. It goes to a very important book called, or an idea from an important book called Are We Good Enough for Liberty? And it's like, we better use this opportunity before the meltdown to make ourselves good enough for liberty, because there will come a time when the government can't pay its bills. It won't fulfill its promises, as you articulated well in your speech. Its promises are not fulfillable by just basic economic reality, basic economic and financial reality. So right now we're not good enough for liberty, which is why we don't have it. Now later, if a collapse ensues, we need to make sure we are good enough for it, because that's going to be kind of one choice out of, I don't know, Mad Max kind of stuff. Road Warrior, total chaos, total meltdown, warlords fighting each other. But that's the thing. I hope we do have time before the collapse. As bad as the system is, I kind of hope it does chug along for a little longer, so we can build ourselves up, build up our communities, build, like, kind of detach ourselves to whatever extent we can from some of these kind of the status quo, and prepare ourselves for the opportunity. Because when the system collapses, and I think it will, like, there will be a great default, the promises can't be fulfilled, people are gonna, at that point, they will look for who's been right all along, but also who can take care of them, who can help them, who can help their communities. So it's really important, if you're a serious libertarian, don't totally detach yourself from society. Really become more involved in society and become a pillar of your community if you can. Build up wealth, build up some influence, help people in your neighborhood, help people in your community. I don't know if it's whatever institutions people are involved in, secular or religious or whatever, but really act as if a collapse is coming, because it is. We just don't know when. Hopefully we have more time than some people think. You know, if it's 5 years away, okay. If it's 20 years away, maybe 50, 100 years, who knows how long these systems can really perpetuate themselves. But it's our responsibility, I think, to do the best we can to prepare to become intellectual, moral, and economic leaders in the future. So, I mean, libertarians, get good professions, become, you don't necessarily have to infiltrate the university, although maybe some people are capable of doing that, but become an important part of your community so that you can help people when it is collapsing and the government won't be able to take care of itself or take care of everyone. Because so many people are dependent, and there's still going to be dependent, needy people after a collapse. You want to be able to hopefully protect people, help them out. And that involves building some alternative institutions. It involves not necessarily trying to take over the government or anything, but just disentangling yourself as much as possible, but at the same time being part of the real community, the real society, the real voluntary interactions in our lives, and be the absolute best you can, because it's like when the day of judgment comes, and it will come, you want to make sure you weren't wasting your time up to that point.
Wow, Clayton, I should get you to be my speechwriter for the next election.
Oh, you're too kind. You're too kind.
That's no, that was beautiful, and but I also think it's true. We have a comment from the Libertarian Party of Saskatchewan. They say, exactly, if libertarians want to, all right, well, we have it on the screen here, to show charitable options as being better than government, we need to all practice what we preach. Very, very true.
And if I can just jump on this point a little bit, and maybe this is some of the baggage that comes from like the whole Ayn Rand kind of thing. And I love Ayn Rand, don't get me wrong. I love her novels, but sometimes I think the libertarian attitude is like, well, I shouldn't have to take care of people. But we do. Like, there, in every society, there's always going to be people who cannot take care of themselves. We know the government does it very badly, but somebody has to do it. Like, a normal, healthy society doesn't want just needy people to die in the streets and such. There's a lot of things people can do to help their communities, whether it's in churches or other kinds of organizations. You can really help needy people in a much healthier way than what the government does now. The welfare system is so soul-sucking and evil and destructive of people that it's really incumbent on us to provide an alternative. And yeah, it sucks. They take so much of our money for these horrible things that supposedly help people, and they throw things at libertarians like, hey, you don't want to help people, you hate people, you're selfish. No, we think the government is very bad at helping people. But also libertarians, I think, unfortunately, I'm guilty of it too in some ways, but we really need to step up in some ways and be involved in our communities and actually help people. Even though we lose a lot of resources to the government, we still have to allocate some of our resources to helping people who need it. And that's part of that community or social leadership that we can demonstrate, really put our money where our mouth is, that, hey, we can do this better. And hey, maybe join us and you can be part of making a healthier society too.
This reminds me of a book I read a long time ago, which I think you would really enjoy, and maybe our listeners would as well. It's called The Welfare State We're In, written by James Bartholomew, the British writer. And the advantage of that Britain has over us is, of course, its history is much longer, and he's got access to data anyway, one of the takeaway from that book is that things like mutual aid societies or charities did a far better job to helping people than governments did.
Yeah, and David Beito, or how do you pronounce his name? He has a really good book. Mutual Aid's in the title. I'm blanking out on the name, but Beito is the author's last name. It's like From Mutual Aid to Welfare State, I think is the title. It's an amazing look at how these societies work, like these fraternal organizations and these mutual aid societies. They took very good care of people. They had their own hospitals. They had all these amazing kind of insurance systems for people, but they also held people accountable too. Like, it's not like we think of the welfare system as rewarding in some ways the worst of the worst people. And mutual aid was really like people working together to take care of, the orphans and widows and such. And really an amazing book. I'd be curious to follow up on that one you mentioned, but definitely something to look into, because it's inspiring to see how those things actually did in fact work before the government took over all that kind of social aid stuff.
And the last point you made there, I think, cannot be overstated. The moral suasion that the mutual aid societies or neighborhood aid societies, it was very powerful. If I recall in the book, he talks about helping a family in need where the father was a drunk, essentially. And, a couple of guys went to see him and they said, we're going to help you. I mean, yeah, your people, yeah, your reaction would be maybe typical of a lot of people. A lot of people would say, well, okay, so there's a bit of implied violence, but it wasn't even that. It was just kind of a stern talking to, saying, we're going to help you this time, but you really have got to stop, right? And this type of talk, this type of accountability no longer exists. When an anonymous check appears, not anonymous, but like a check that is issued without human contact or deposited to your account with no follow-up, I mean, it's a recipe for disaster. So no, your points are excellent. Yeah.
I think Beto's book talks about something similar, where there was like a kind of communitarian health insurance program, and it's like you were disqualified if you had participated in a riot. Like, they wouldn't cover your medical bills.
Right.
They wanted people to stay out of trouble.
Well, I think it's the same book. I always thought it was such an interesting, there are many aspects that scare me about you need a village to raise a child, but I certainly understand that extended family, grandparents, and can play a vital role. But this one was there was an implicit understanding among the Italian community in New York that if an Italian cop found an Italian, say, teenager or kid up to mischief, that he could be taken in an alley and roughed up a little bit. But the understanding was, after kind of teaching the kid some manner, he was to take the kid to his parents, explain that what had happened, right? And the parents didn't object. But this code, he said, was very ethnic specific. In other words, an Italian cop couldn't do this to an Irish kid, or an Irish cop couldn't do this to an Italian kid, right? Like it was almost kind of not quite familial, but again, as long as you have these understanding, right? I mean, these Italian parents would say to the cop, thank you very much for, straighten them out, because and we're going to do our end at home as well to make sure it doesn't happen. So anyway, I think you'd enjoy the book.
Yeah, it sounds really good. I like that kind of stuff, because it's sometimes hard to imagine how that's supposed to work. And even for us who should know better, it still remains mysterious. Like, how do you replace these institutions that we take for granted that the government just kind of handles it?
Yeah. All right. Well, Clayton, this has been great. I suggest that we end on this note, unless you have some even better parting comments.
I don't know. I would say, well, thank you for being a gracious host and your kind words. And it was amusing seeing some of the comments in the chat box there, and just love talking about this stuff and exploring ideas and solutions and different intellectual traditions. So it's always good to have an opportunity to speak about things like this with someone like yourself. I would say, you know, keep up the fight for liberty, but don't be like Rothbard, you know, short-term pessimism, long-term optimism, but you gotta do some work to make that optimism justified.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on our very first episode of Libertarian Lens. And again, a reminder to everyone, please become a member and support the Libertarian Party of Canada. We need your help. So, thank you, everyone.